topic by topic. Today we want to have a look at ecosystems and biomes and see if we can get our head around what they are, what happens, and so on. So let's have a look at some ideas, and we'll start off with having a look at what is one of these things called an ecosystem and see where we can go from there. So let's have a look at an ecosystem. We'll zoom in here and we'll have a think about what is an ecosystem. So an ecosystem, well, it's made up from basically everything that's going on. So it's basically here all the living organisms that we can think of, that how they live, how they interact with one another in a defined area. But it's also something to do with the physical factors that are there in this region. Ecosystems basically vary in size from the very small, where we might have something like a terrarium, I gave one of these to my mother and she managed to prove that you can actually destroy one of these environments. So I'm looking to build it again for her, and in here I've got everything that we need. I've got the little plants growing, all the water required for it, and it's a self-contained system. Nothing else is basically required for it. But the largest system that I can think of would go to the other end of the spectrum, and that is the whole Earth, because the whole of the Earth is basically one very large ecosystem. Basically, an ecosystem is a dynamic system, and by that I mean that it's constantly changing. More living organisms might appear, and this is going to affect how the system works and what goes on with it. If we put more pressure on something with one thing, then something else normally gives. When we look at these systems, we are looking at two parts. We're looking at the biotic factors and similarly the abiotic factors. Many students seem to find some of these difficult. They shouldn't be, but they do find biotic factors and abiotic factors quite difficult to try and have a look at and be sure about. So let's start with the easiest one. We'll start with the abiotic features and we'll see what we can do about these. So let's have some abiotic factors, and the first of these is probably the sun, and basically, as far as I'm concerned with the sun, this is the solar energy input, and this is basically affected by things like the latitude. I suppose it's also affected by the season, and something that I've been noticing very much over the last couple of months, the cloud cover. I'm seeing that since this COVID-19 pandemic has started, that the cloud cover seems to be less. Yeah, we've had high pressure before, but there's less planes, less of those clouds being produced. There's less pollution, and so we're getting less cloud formation. And so all sorts of things may affect cloud cover. I suppose there's something to do with also the sort of changes in the Earth's orbit, which I suppose is also part to do with the seasons, of how close and how far we are from the sun. The sun kicks off the entire system because this is going to affect all the plants, and the light here is also going to affect many animals' behaviour. The season, the amount of light will often kick off different sort of animals' reproductive cycles. So we've got the sun. Related to the sun then obviously is climate, and the climate's going to include things like rainfall, it's going to include wind, and obviously to do with this, temperature. What other things are going to affect the system? And this is the world of topography. This is our altitude. This basically is also related to the climate, I suppose. It also depends on the slope of the land. Are we flat? Are we sloped? We can also worry about the aspect of our land, which way it faces, and drainage. Are we going to be living in a boggy land, or are we going to live in a very dry land? And all of this affects basically the system, our abiotic factors. We can look at quite a few more abiotic factors, and then we'll go and have a look at biomes. So let's try a few more abiotic factors, and we'll have a look and see what we can do with these. Right, so let's start off with some more. Well, one of the ones that I've got is oxygen concentration. I'm not here necessarily thinking of how much oxygen that I'm going to be able to breathe in, although that certainly will affect me. But I'm thinking now here of perhaps creatures that live in the sea or ponds, and that's going to be also affected by temperature. The hotter the temperature, the less oxygen is going to be in there. And what can affect that is whether this is a pond and it's not moving, whether it's going to be a stream, it's going to be fast moving and well oxygenated by little waterfalls and rapids, and they're going to affect these things compared with perhaps a pond that might be stagnant, and we can have some differences there. There are, of course, other factors that might be connected with perhaps the soil, and some of these factors are called edaphatic ones. Edific factors here. Right, so let's have a look at some edific factors, something to do with basically the soil. This can be the pH of the soil. This is also affected largely by the geology of what's underneath. Where I live, we've got lots of chalk, so there's lots of chalk under the ground. So it makes a lot of difference to the sort of what plants grow. We can get the soil here. We've got things like sandy soils, we've got clay types of soil, very different between what they're going to be like, whether they're going to drain or not. And we've got the aeration of the soil, how well aerated it's going to be. Other factors that are going to affect things: pollution. Seeing less of this at the moment, but this can be pollution of the air, pollution of the water, pollution of the land, whether something is perhaps trying to live on a landfill site and what it's going to do. And something that sort of affects a lot of systems, I suppose, are the catastrophes. Whether it be, as we get in lovely England, things like floods. I was reminded about the floods we had in February here, where large parts of our land were underwater, and now people are complaining about, only a couple of months later, a drought. It's not just things like floods, fires, as we've had in Australia, burning large areas of woodland. But it can also be more extreme, with things such as earthquakes, and obviously go with that, volcanoes. So all of these sort of catastrophes can affect what's going on in one of these abiotic systems. Let's have a look at these abiotic systems all together, and if we look at the world as a whole, then we see this as basically a large biome. Here the biome is the world and the type of sort of land that we've got. I'll highlight just a few of these. So I might have then the deserts. Let's start with the deserts in Australia. Apologies to the Australians where I'm trying to put the thing here. Let's see. Well, I know that most of Saudi Arabia around there, that's going to be a desert. We've got the deserts really sticking on the other side of going across here, the Sahara Desert. Not just onto the coast, so there we are. That's pretty awful drawing of some of the deserts there. And we've got, I suppose, more of the deserts somewhere around here in America. Going down there, sort of idea. Probably even going a little bit further up. And then we've got the deserts down here. And then let's not forget large swathes of desert that we've got here. So that's just putting in some deserts of where they're going to have various bits and pieces growing. We might try some other ones. Let's just try and put in one other biome of where we would find mixed deciduous forest land. So somewhere down there, probably extending up here a little bit, and a fair amount of stuff coming across this on this side of the United States. And I suppose we've got a really nice big area here. I don't seem to have a nice shading in system here, so we can put that in there. And of course we've got the other side in Africa where we can put some of these in. Where I live in the UK and Ireland, we've got most of Europe being rather nice for this, and on the other side of Russia and down through China, I suppose I better give Australia a little bit. And we've got lots of this sort of basically biomes, countries which are going to be basically the similar type of geography, and yeah, I'm just going to have to leave that. But you can get the idea of trying to draw some of these things in. Better, of course, if I have a look at a map of some of this, and there is one I've nicked from the internet, and they're the main biomes of the world that you can see, sort of much better than what I've managed to achieve, but you can get the idea of what we've got around the world, the main biomes, about what sort of abiotic sort of systems we've got, and anything within one of these, this is how it's going to try and grow. So we've got these main biomes, and of course these biomes are going to be, if you start drilling down and looking at them, they're also going to be subdivided into various different areas, because we look at how things sort of vary, how sort of just a bit of land can make all the difference. If I try to draw this out for us here, what I'm going to try and do is draw a nice cross section here across a hill, and somewhere down here we're going to have the river, and I've got low-lying land here, and this is going to be subject to flood. Then going up some way along these things, I might have things like rocky outcrops, and when I reach a rocky outcrop, we're not going to have much here. We're going to have very poor soil depth, and we're not going to manage various things growing here. We've got here things like steep slopes, and as soon as I get a steep slope, then I'm limited what can manage to grow there. We're also looking at height, and at different height limits this can control what plants can grow. And I might have this side, let's say this is going to be on the south side, this is going to be on the north side. This north slope then would have less sun, so that could affect what's going to go on. We've got, as we go up through here, temperatures. It gets colder the higher up we go. I'm always amazed when I look at Africa and you go and have a look at the African sort of climate and you're thinking, oh, this is going to be really hot, and as you go up the mountain you see there's actually snow on the mountain, even though we're fairly close to the equator, because the temperature varies at altitude. So all of this topography affects what's going on. So even though this may be in one biome, here we've got an awful lot of variation, and only by looking in fairly closely at each different ecosystem can we see what's going on, what communities we've got, what populations we've got, and we'll look at the different habitats, because an ecosystem is made up from each of these different habitats. So that's looking at the abiotic factors. Now let's go and have a look at some of the biotic factors to see what they do and how they affect what's going on. So if we look at some of our here biotic factors, let's think about some of these. So our biotic factors, well, let's start with one of these, and this is the most important I can think of, which is competition. We have got competition going on for things like, well, food. I suppose that's the most important one. I suppose if you're a plant, then perhaps light is equally important here. We're competing for water. We are competing, I suppose, really for space. They all want their own little bit of space, and even when I talk to people, they like their own amount of space. Some people like living on top of one another, but other people like a lot more space. They like to have a little bit of separation. And all of these competitions can be divided into two sorts. We've got either the intra-specific here, or which is going to be within species, or I can have the interspecific, which is going to be here basically again between species. All of these factors affect the competition. Competition is not just for food, light, water and space, but other things. We're going to have competition for mates as well, and that can affect a situation. So this ability to try and find a mate. We've also got to look at things like predation. We've got to look for things like, well, I suppose for some animals, the amount of grazing. Different animals can feed on the same materials, but if we're not careful, some of them, like for instance geese, will eat grass down to a few millimeters above the ground, and that would stop larger animals getting in there. Disease is going to be a major problem here with organisms, and I'm thinking specifically here of seeing how the changes to our way of life that COVID-19 is making. Parasites, I suppose that's going to also affect some organisms where basically all of these are where we're going to have relationships between different organisms where one is going to benefit at the other's expense. I suppose in that same way we can have mutualism, where here we're going to benefit both partners. The one that I always think of there are things like my favourite runner beans and nitrogen fixing bacteria. So we've got quite a lot of things here, but it doesn't end here, because many of these things here are density dependent. If I've got lots of organisms very close to one another, then we have different things going on, and even in humans we can look at the difference between what's going on in a city and what's going on in the countryside. We look at how things can affect what's going on here, but it's not just humans that have this problem. We've got all sorts of things happening here. If I look at what's going on in a population density, is that the higher the density here, the greater the competition for all those things that we've looked at before. The food, the light, the water, mates and so on. So all of those things that are density dependent are going to affect the competition. We could choose how the abundance and distribution of organisms are going to affect both the biotic and, I suppose to a certain extent, the abiotic. Because if we've got perhaps poor weather, then if I have poor weather, then this is because of the density, it can affect how all the systems work together. Weather can also not only affect the biotic factors but the abiotic as well, I suppose. We can look at the weather could easily change the pH of the soil. It can change the amount of water in the soil, and that is going to affect all the biotic systems. Some creatures are going to require water so that they can reproduce. I'm thinking of things like ferns here. Whereas if it's a dry season, different things are going to happen. Trees here are affected by the abiotic factors, such as the water content of the soil, the humidity, the light available. But those abiotic features then affect the biotic features of the tree. The amount of water can then alter perhaps the size of the tree, the location of the tree. So we've got lots of these biotic factors affect density, and this basically has knock-on effects on everything else. Another one we've got is the Anthropogenic Factors. Basically those factors arriving from human activity, and these can be, of course, both biotic, killing off different livestock, killing off different animals by changing the abiotic features. So we've got human activities here changing, and this is what's changing our ecological footprint, the effect of humans on the global environment, and this at present has been far greater than the effect of any other species. If I were to think of England and take you for a walk in England, perhaps 10-20,000 years ago, England would be a lovely, lush forest. But walk around now and, well, let's go back perhaps another just 2,000 years ago and go for a walk 2,000 years ago, and the land would have changed. Many of the forests were cut down. We had small populations, but starting to do all the farming, and this changing how the ecology of the system works. So we've got here these idea of having our UK. We've got, if I draw out my UK, then we've got here largely forests. The forests might be slightly different in different parts of the UK, but these forests basically cut down. We've now got a very different view, a look of what England looks like. We've got basically this idea of here deforestation, which I have to quite happily say is being reversed at the moment, which is really a good thing. We've got the idea of burning moors so that we can turn all of this into arable land. Yep, that's what we're trying to change here. This is going to affect what animals live in what places. So we can now get more animals living on grass, because when we've replaced the trees, we've often replaced that with grass, and that's meant that the animals that live in trees and the forests have died out, but the ones in the grass have survived and improved. We've got things like sheep, rabbits. Now if we remove and put those in here, then the problem that we've got is that we've got things like here wolves. Now the wolves, native to the country, if we got rid of all the wolves because we didn't want them to eat our sheep, unfortunately, as well as the sheep increasing, the number of rabbits are increasing because we've got rid of the predators here. And there's a very good story about what happens to the introduction of wolves in Yellowstone National Park. There were no wolves there. They were all got rid of. And this meant that a lot of the deer and other sort of animals like that would graze now where they liked. And this meant they went right up to the riverbanks. And this controlled what other animals were there. And the ecosystem was not really very happy. It was out of balance. The number of deer were increasing exponentially, and that meant they were starting to change the environment, eating, knocking down small trees, and basically changing the whole ecosystem. And so a few wolves were reintroduced, and this meant that the ecosystem was changed. The wolves ate the deer, and the deer stayed more in hiding. Now that's quite useful. What we've got then is deer not going near the water, so it meant other species weren't able to go there. The beavers then increased and changed the rivers by building their sort of little dams. That then meant whole loads of other animals that had virtually disappeared now started to thrive and grew better, and the whole ecosystem was put back into balance by putting back the predators. Now that can happen in large places like Yellowstone National Park, but it's much more difficult for this to happen in perhaps somewhere like England. If we introduce some wolves here, they're going to be in the towns pretty quick, because the distance between towns is very, very small. Where I live, which is in the Chilterns in England, we've got the introduction of the red kite. The red kites had disappeared, and a few years ago they were reintroduced, and a few pairs were introduced, and now there are lots of them. I see every day a red kite, or 2 or 3 or 4, circling overhead. We did have a meeting a little while ago when I went outside of my shed, and on top of the shed was a red kite feeding, and probably both of us were actually quite frightened, and as I went out of the shed, so the red kite noticed me and flew off, doing a fantastic vertical climb. And I don't really know which of us was the most frightened or startled, because seeing a bird that big, that close, I mean it was sort of 6 inches away from me, was quite frightening. So we've got these factors that are going to affect all these things. So removal of predators can cause problems, and we may need to increase the numbers of predators. The big problem is that when we've got the sheep here, we keep them at a high density. And as soon as we keep these at high density, then what we've got to do is we've now got to increase the feeding for these. To try and do this, we've got to bring in things like fencing, and what England, I suppose, is famous for is its hedging. We've got miles and miles of hedges surrounding a field. So I have this field, and surrounding the sides we have hedgerows, and in the hedgerows they can be quite wide. We can have growing here different sorts of trees and shrubs, and this provides an ecosystem here which is different from the one inside, where the farmer's trying to cultivate their grass, they can use lots of fertilizers, and this ecosystem is gradually being changed from a natural one to an unnatural one. So we've got quite a few interesting sort of ecological zones. I'm going to finish by having a look at one that I get my students to have a go at looking at. And let's take the sea, we've got the sand, then we might have some dunes, and then going on. And what I typically do is I'll put a little flag here and a little flag there. Ready? Here they come. Right, so we've got my two little flags, and armed with a trusty quadrat, then what we can do is we can go in and do a transect of the land and see what is actually going to happen. So we've got our first piece, which is going to be the sublittoral zone. This is the zone that's basically really uncovered except at extreme tides. We've got then my lower shore, and my lower shore, relatively stable conditions here, exposed only at low tides, plenty of mineral ions growing. Then I've got the middle shore, where basically it's submerged for half the day and not for the other. Then I've got my upper shore. Here we've got this submerged for only short periods of the day, very high amount of desiccation, and what plants can grow there. And then we get to our next zone, our splash zone. And then moving up from there, we move into our basic dune of what's going on here on the dune. And as we look at this dune, which is here fairly exposed, we come to the much older dune further back, and then as we go back here we appear to go into far more normal and here a stable type of environment, and this can be good fun to have a look at. And if I can manage to find a nice beach that's quiet in the middle of the summer, and the best days are those when nobody seems to want to go to the beach. You'd think people would actually want to go to the beach during the height of summer, but there are some really good days when they don't, and it's days when it's absolutely piddling down with rain, and I can then go down and I can do a transect to the beach quite happily in the height of season, and I find that sunbathers don't want to be there. All you get is a few very hardened families with kids under large tarpaulins trying to sort of dig a bit of sand because that's their holiday. So that's our basic introduction to ecology, looking at some biotic factors, some abiotic factors, and looking at some of the main biomes of the world. What we can do next is move on and have a look and see what we can do to try and understand how these work and how they interact. and we'll do that next time. If you found this useful, please subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.